Welcome to Box Office Recaps. Today we're going to recap action, thriller, and horror movie called Hush, which was released in 2016. Spoilers ahead. The movie opens with Maddie, a deaf and dumb writer who lives in the middle of nowhere. Cooking lunch, she receives a message from her next-door neighbor Sarah, asking to stop by Maddie's place. Maddie let her come over. Sarah comes over to Maddie's house telling her that she has finished reading her book. When Maddie asks if she likes the book, Sarah says she loved it and asked her what secret was for her good writing. Maddie says that she hears a voice in her head that sounds like her mom's voice, which helps her write. While they are speaking, the fire alarm goes off. The alarm sounded as the food Maddie was cooking burned. Maddie removes the fire alarm from the wall and sets it on the kitchen counter, shutting it up. Sarah asks Maddie to come over for dinner, but she declines by saying she had work to do. Sarah leaves, promising to come back tomorrow. Maddie receives a message from Craig, her ex-boyfriend, who missed her. Maddie deletes the text. Sometime later, Maddie is trying to decide on an ending to her book, but cannot. She is frustrated and calls Craig, but cuts the call, twice. She then receives a call from Craig. She slams her laptop closed and ignores the call. Maddie then moves to the kitchen to clean dishes. Sarah suddenly appears and starts banging on the door, trying to get help from Maddie. Sarah then gets shot in the back with an arrow, and a man in the mask stabs Sarah multiple times while looking at Maddie. As Sarah dies, the man throws her body in the side and knocks on Maddie's window, failing to grab her reaction. The man then gives up and takes Sarah's body. Maddie receives a call from Craig again, and she flips the phone upside down and goes back to her laptop. Maddie tries to write again as the killer opens the door and gets into the house with a knife in his hand, standing behind Maddie. The killer doesn't kill her. He sheaths his blade. When Maddie receives a call from Max, Maddie's sister and the killer move out of the sight of the laptop camera. Max and Maddie talk about Maddie's dating life and ask her to move to the city. As they talk, Max notices something move in the background. Maddie assures Max that it is probably the cat. Maddie cuts the call and starts to search for the cat. When Maddie cannot find the cat, she resumes her work but gets scared when she receives photos of her searching for the cat from her phone. Maddie looks around horrified and moves towards the door and discovers the killer with her phone. Maddie runs towards the door and closes it, stopping the killer from entering the house. The killer then tries to find another entrance to the house, but fails as Maddie locks all the entrances. Maddie then tries to call 911 on her laptop, but the killer shuts down the power of the house. Maddie tries to connect to John and Sarah's Wi-Fi, which is password protected. The killer scratches her window with a bloody knife and then slashes Maddie's car tires. Maddie grabs a lipstick and a flashlight. She writes, "Won't tell, didn't see face, boyfriend coming home," on the window and flashes light on it to scare the killer away. The unscared killer reads it and reveals his face. The killer asks Maddie if she can read his lips. She nods her head. The killer calls her bluff. He then tells her that he can come in whenever he wants, but won't, and that he will come in when the time is right. The killer tells her to nod her head if she understands. Maddie nods her head. The killer tells her to have fun and enjoy it. Maddie now grabs a knife and a hammer. She then locks herself in her bedroom. The killer using Sarah's dead body to knock on the bedroom window, horrifying Maddie, which leads her to drop the hammer in the bedroom and run out of the room. Once out of the room, she started crying on the floor. When she calms down, she remembers about the phone in Sarah's back pocket. To retrieve it, she distracts the killer by sounding the alarm of her car and rushes to Sarah's dead body. As Maddie rushes back to the window to retrieve Sarah's phone, the killer turns back to Sarah's body. Seeing the killer coming back, Maddie tries to close the window, but the killer's hand gets stuck in it. To remove the hand, she stabs the killer with a dropped hammer and successfully closes the window. The killer takes Sarah's clothes and wraps them around his wound. He shows Sarah's phone that Maddie was trying to get. Maddie leaves the room. Maddie gets out of the house, but as she hears the killer approaching, she hides under her porch. The killer then moves away from where Maddie is, and she makes a break for it, but is stopped by the killer's arrow hitting the tree behind her. The killer shoots another arrow as Maddie gets back into her house. The killer retrieves his arrows and resumes walking around. Maddie runs upstairs looking at the killer from above. She opens the upstairs window and tries to escape through the roof. She throws her flashlight into the woods, forcing the killer to investigate. Maddie gets to her feet, moves along the roof. She lowers herself down. Suddenly, an arrow hits Maddie in the back of her thigh. She gets back on the roof as the killer loads another arrow. The killer shoots again as Maddie falls back. The killer looks back towards the roof and tries to climb up. Maddie removes the arrow from her leg. As the killer approaches, Maddie waits for him on the top and punches him as he reaches the top. He drops the bow on the roof and Maddie gets back into the house as he climbs back up. She then rushes to close the window and closes it just in time. Maddie points the bow at the killer as he leaves. Injured, Maddie limps towards the bathroom and performs first aid on her open wound. She then picks up the bow and sees marks on the bow. She tries to load the bow but fails multiple times as the tension on the string is too much for her. Sarah's boyfriend John arrives and is searching for her. He discovers the writing on the glass by Maddie. The killer, impersonating a police officer, asks for John's ID and asks for his phone to call back up. The killer makes a fake phone call. John, suspicious of him, asks if the killer had seen the writing on the glass. The killer affirmed and started asking about Maddie. While returning John's phone, the killer drops Sarah's earring, which he picked up earlier. John, confirming his suspicion, keeps asking the killer questions. Meanwhile, Maddie is still trying to load the bow while the killer keeps inquiring about her from John. John points to a plant, telling the killer where Maddie keeps her spare keys. Killer moves towards the plant to investigate as John picks up a large rock. As John is about to hit the killer, Maddie bangs the front door, distracting John. He then gets stabbed by the killer. Blood pouring from his neck, John lunges at the killer, who slashes his leg. As John bleeds, he leaps towards the killer, throwing him to the ground. Maddie tries to load the bow again. She fails. John then began to strangle the killer. He tells Maddie to run. Maddie opens the back door. Maddie, trying to escape, gets near the back door and starts to imagine the killer catching up to her and hitting her on the head with a rock, bringing her to the ground, bashing her dead. But then, her eyes suddenly open as she says, "You can't run." Maddie retreats into the house, unable to open the door. John finally loses his strength and dies as the killer gasps for air. Maddie is frozen and unable to move. Her voice tells her that she cannot run, hide, or wait, and the only option left is to kill him. The killer takes John's watch from his dead body and pats him down, finding cigarettes. He then grabs a wrench from Maddie's car. He sits on the hood of the car and lights a cigarette, looking at John's dead body. The killer is deciding whether to finish Maddie off now, but decides to wait a while longer. The killer finds Maddie's cat and is about to kill it, but is shot with an arrow on his side. He pulls it out and starts to run towards Maddie. Maddie rushes back and dropping an arrow outside. She reaches out to retrieve it, but the killer slams the door on her wrist. The killer stamps on Maddie's wrist. Maddie draws her broken hand inside the locked door. The killer looks at Maddie, crouches down and breaks the arrow in front of a sobbing Maddie. The killer announces that he is coming in. Maddie suddenly stops sobbing and calmly maintaining a deadly stare at the killer. She dips her finger into her wounded leg and writes on the glass. The killer steps back and reads, "Do it." She resumes staring at him with a deathly stare. She again dips her finger back into the wound and writes, "Coward." The killer gets the wrench and starts breaking the glass door down, as Maddie starts typing a description of the killer and a farewell to her parents and Max. Maddie then grabs the knife she dropped and locked the bedroom door. She then locks herself into the bathroom attached to the bedroom. She sits down on the floor with the knife pointed toward the door. Her vision starts to blur. She is unable to keep her eyes open, and her vision is cloudy as the killer lowers himself onto the bathtub behind her. As the killer is about to stab her, she feels his breath on the back of her neck. She dodges his slash and stabs him in the thigh. The killer drops his blade and Maddie limps and staggers out towards the living room. With blurry vision, Maddie rushes to the kitchen counter, supporting herself on it. As she moves towards the knives, she collapses on the ground. The killer gets out of the bedroom in anger and pain. He finds Maddie, seemingly unconscious, in the kitchen and heads towards her. When he gets close to her, she opens her eyes and sprays hornet killer spray into his eyes. He jumps back in pain and starts to stumble. Maddie drops the spray bottle, gets up and flashes the fire alarm in his eyes as the killer swings his knife. Maddie thrusts the flashing light of the fire alarm into his eyes and he drops the knife. Maddie then puts down the fire alarm and tries to grab the knife, but is stuck by the killer on the ground. The killer kicks and beats her. Maddie bites his hand, but he is unfazed. He then slaps her and starts to strangle her. She tries to grab him, but can't get a hold of him. She tries to squeeze his wounded shoulder, but he tightens his grip around her neck. As Maddie loses her breath, she begins to have images of her childhood. Maddie's fingertips reach the wine bottle opener, and she stabs the killer in his neck, and he begins to bleed from the wounds. He tries to cover one wound, but the blood rushes from the other side. The killer then slumps on Maddie. She pushes him off herself. Maddie then looks at the killer and then towards the ceiling. Maddie, gasping for air, starts to blink. She gets up and grabs the phone from the killer's pocket and dials 911. She then lies back down next to the dead killer, the lights flashing and the fire alarm sounding around the room. We see Sarah's body lies outside the bedroom window and John's body in front of the house. Maddie limps outside the house, then sits on the front porch staring into the woods. Bitch, the cat, comes to her and she strokes her as the police arrive. She lies down and a smile appears across her face. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe for more recaps.